Hey guys, Greg Benz here. I recently got an email from photographer Jim K, who sent me this image of this bird with a question that a lot of you have had, which is how can I use Lumenzia to help cut out a subject like this in order to help further isolate it from the background? And we're going to go ahead and process it in full in this tutorial. I've already done the raw processing in Lightroom, so let me catch you up before we get over to Photoshop. To begin with, this is the original raw as I received it from Jim. Then I've gone and I made a quick crop as well as some lens corrections. If we go down to the lens corrections tab, you'll see that I have a little bit of distortion here set to -4, as well as some vignetting, which helped take care of the corners and make the bird look a bit more prominent. Then I went in and did the bulk of the raw processing in another virtual copy here, where you can see I have cooled down the white balance a bit. I've increased the whites and decreased the blacks to give the bird a bit more pop, a little bit of texture to bring out some detail overall. Added some lights with a curve to further lighten some of the highlights. And in the detail here, it's pretty interesting. This is an unusual sharpening approach for me, but the original image had to be shot at high ISO, and so there's a fair bit of noise. What I've done is use a larger radius with low detail and some masking in order to help bring out detail while minimizing any noise that's coming from around the bird in the background here. You can see from before to after that I've got a good bit of detail coming through without bringing out a lot of noise in the background around the bird. Of course, to help do that, I also added some noise reduction. Then finally, I went and added a bit of color through the camera calibration tab where I've increased the red and the blue saturation, giving the bird just a bit of a boost in the colors, not too much, but enough to accentuate it and make it look more interesting. At this point, we're ready to go head over to Photoshop and do the more tricky work of cutting out the bird here so we can darken the surroundings. And I'm going to send the original as well, just for the sake of comparison. Now that we've got our layers in Photoshop, I'm going to drag the original to the bottom, just rename it Original Raw as a reminder that it's just there for reference, and I'm going to hide it. So we just have one important layer right now, which is this bird that we've processed. What I want to do is darken the background, and in order to do that, I'm going to go and duplicate this layer by hitting Command or Control J, and on top, we'll rename this as Bird and Branch, because we're going to mask it and reveal this on top of what below is going to be a darker version of the image. And to make this actually darker, let's go up to Filter, Camera Raw Filter, and we'll just take the exposure slider down by about 1/3 of a stop ought to do the trick to help darken this background. Of course, this is darkening everything, but what we're going to do now is mask in the upper layer that's going to reveal the bird and branch up above. So we have this nice, beautiful bird here and the darker background behind it. To get this going, normally at this point, I'd go and use luminosity selections to help go and find things that are consistently lighter than the background, maybe tweaking the mask, trying to find that difference. But you see that parts of the subjects like this branch are brighter than the background and the bird's beak, or parts of the feathers, they're brighter than the surroundings, but other parts are actually darker, like some of the tail feathers, the claws, the bottom of this branch. So, I can play with a luminosity selection in part of the image and work that in. I could go switch over to something like a darks and then go try and work on other parts of the branch that are missing, but it's going to be really tricky because the problem here is the background is so similar to almost all the tones in the branch and a lot of the tones in the edge of this bird. So this is not a great candidate for using luminosity selections because the luminosity really isn't changing in this image. We can do it, and certainly we can use it to clean up parts of the image, but I don't think it's the best place to start. Instead, I'm going to go up to the Edge tool in Lumenzia, click on that, and use this Mask Subject feature here. I've got it set to Simple Edge. What will happen when we click on it is it's going to help isolate this bird automatically and bring up the Select and Mask workspace so we can complete the selection. What you're seeing here is this overlay. So you go to the overlay mode here, set it to 25% opacity with red, and you'll get a view like this where everything that's clear is masked in and everything that's red would be masked out. We could look at it alternatively on black or some other version if that is more clear to you. But what I like about the overlay is it's going to make it very easy to help select what we need from this image. The way we can complete it, because we need to go and grab the branch and all this kind of stuff, is go up and use the Quick Select tool here to refine things. Quick Select is going to go and automatically find similar components. So if I go and click and drag here, you see how it's automatically bringing in the branch. So you might be thinking Quick Select should show marching ants, but remember that what we have effectively in the Select and Mask workspace is a selection, and the clear stuff is selected. So when I drag the Quick Select, I'm bringing in more selected stuff in the image. Now, the other thing that's cool about this ruby red overlay is it can help us find any mistakes if we go switch it over to Show Edge. And when we click Show Edge, what it's doing is it's showing the areas where this refined radius is automatically being applied, or if you've manually applied it. Now at 2 pixels, you can see there's some issues. For example, parts of the feather here fall outside of the edge detection. So I need to use a broader radius, and I'm going to jump all the way up to something like 12 pixels, which I think ought to do the job nicely. And you can see that this edge now properly selects everything that I want. The other benefit of this approach is that it also gives us a really nice outline of whatever is selected. So for example, I can see part of this tail feather is not selected. I can see that this part of the branch here is not selected. It gives me a really good way of knowing what I need to go and further include in my selection. So I can go back to the Quick Select and just come back and click and drag to expand my selection anywhere it's incomplete. And you can see the edge should move out to the edge of the branch when I have a proper Quick Select. If I zoom in a little bit here, I'm just hitting Command plus or Command minus, I can see that wasn't properly selected. So I can drag that down and include that. And if I went outside, I can hold the Alt or Option key to get the negative version and just remove that with a Quick Select. So I'm just going to massage this edge until it falls naturally where it should be, which is the true edge of this branch. And when things look like they do here, then that's exactly what I want. So I can go and work on the foot here, make sure that that is selected. And if I don't quite complete it there, I might need a smaller radius, bring that through, just being careful not to select into these open spaces. But as long as the edge is kind of tracing the edge of the foot, then I've got a good selection. Something like this here, I can use a much smaller radius and drag down, try and make sure that's properly selected. And if I don't get it here, then there's other tools and techniques we can use. But I'm just going to keep working my way across this thing, making sure I'm grabbing details like the missing branch here. Again, I just want kind of this wider looking edge nicely hugging the edge of the branch here. And that tells me that I've properly selected things. And notice that edge just jumped across the bird here. So I'm going to hit Control Z or Command Z to undo that. And I want to make sure that I'm staying on the edge of the branch here and not filling in the rest of the bird. And it looks like I'm just going to struggle a bit here. So I'm going to undo that. And instead, if I can't get that done, what I can do in lieu of that is go use the Refine Edge brush, where I'm going to manually tell it where the edges are so I can paint on the actual edge here and say, hey, go refine this, but it's not using the Quick Select that's going to automatically grab more stuff. And in here, I can just go and kind of brush these edges because I can tell already just looking at it that it's way too complicated, and Quick Select's not going to be able to know the difference between this pixel and these pixels out here. They're just far too similar, almost identical really. And things like these little toes, I can brush over the edge of them to make sure that they're part of the selection. I'm going to come up and go back to the Quick Select tool, which is shortcut W, just like in regular Photoshop, and continue this process, zooming back a bit and just dragging up through the rest of this, trying to get the rest of this branch. And if I don't get it all in one go, I'm going to have to come back and clean edges. I can see here as it's catching up that that's not going to be included. So I'm going to have to come back down there. And in order to do those things a little more precisely, I'm going to zoom in and just kind of keep working on this edge as I need to clean it up. Again, I want the white along the edge of this branch. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and speed things up to just quickly trace the rest of this as I've been doing. And now that I've got a proper selection of all the edges here, I can turn off the show edges, just take a look. Seems like a great overall targeting to me. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And this is popping up from Lumenzia asking if we want to paint in the refined edge with a brush. I'm going to say no, but it just gives you the option to determine where you're going to paint the refined edges on this mask versus applying them globally. So at this point, we've gone and we've created our lighter version of the bird on this branch. Let's just zoom in a bit and see how it looks up close. And I don't see any problematic telltale edges here that suggest any issues other than one little spot I want to go fix here. If I zoom in here, you can see this edge just didn't get properly selected. No surprise, the pixels are really basically identical inside and outside the bird. To fix this, we don't need anything more complicated than just a brush. So I'm gonna hit B for my brush, shrink it down to a nice small size. And remember, what we have now is a layer mask. If I alt click on the mask, it's just black and white with all the refined edges. What I want to do is switch to black paint, and I'm just manually going to paint black here to remove the lighter version of the bird in this area because it's very easy to do and there's no reason to go to a more complex tool. So at this point, the cutout is done and we're ready to move on to the next steps, which for me are going to be the dodging and burning of this bird to just add more detail. And in fact, I think we could get a little bit more detail by using the camera raw filter a bit. So I'm going to, in this case, let's see, I want to convert this to a smart object. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pull my mask off for a second so I don't lose the ability to edit it on the outside. I'm going to right click on the layer and I'm going to choose to convert to a smart object. I'm doing it this way so that the mask stays outside and I'm just going to drag it back up. So now I have a smart object that I can work with the filter on this thing and the mask stayed on the outside. If I had converted to a smart object with the mask on it, I would have had the mask inside the smart object and it would just be more work to go and grab it when I needed it. So what I can do now is go up to Filter, Camera Raw Filter, and what I'm thinking is the dehaze tool may bring out a little definition here. Bring that up. And I just kind of like how that's bringing out a little bit more detail in this bird. It's also increasing some of the inherent yellow in the shot. I see the white balance changed overall. So I'm going to bring the temperature down a little bit, maybe the tint down one notch to just try and maintain some neutrality. And the bird is looking pretty good. That's where I'm mostly worried about neutrality here. So I think right around -4 and just maybe -1 or so on the tint. Clicking OK, which adjusts it overall. And with this smart filter mask, what I'm going to do is click on it, hit Command or Control I to invert, which hides that adjustment. And now I can use a brush with white paint. I'm going to switch this to make white be the foreground. And I can paint in the areas where I want that detail. If we shift click the filter mask, we can see that's the kind of detail we can add. And I think it's doing a nice job on the branch as well as various parts of this bird. So I'm just going to go with my white brush, reveal the adjustment wherever I think it's adding to the image. And I think, so the back of this bird here looks a little bit more interesting and could perhaps go a little bit more on some of the other feathered areas around the eye a little bit. Don't want to go too crazy, but I do think that it has its place in certain parts of this edit here. And if we just turn this off, we can see from before to after toggling with the undo key, how that's just added a little bit more definition by using the dehaze camera raw filter on this. And we converted it to a smart object just simply so I can go back and make different decisions later if I decide that was the wrong amount of dehaze or my offsetting white balance wasn't correct or something like that. It's not mandatory, but I like to work as non-destructively as I can in general. Now that we have that, I'm going to go ahead and start the dodging and burning. So click on Dodge, and I'm going to create a transparent layer in soft light blend mode. So we can make some subtle adjustments to the bird. Specifically, I'd like to create more definition in these feathers and make the eyes pop a bit more. Let's start with the eyes by zooming in here, hitting B for our brush. I'm going to switch to white paint. And what I want to do is lighten up some of this white here, as well as some of the eye detail. Now, if I go and just brush on it as is, it's going to lighten everything, including the shadows, and that looks pretty flat and boring. So I'm going to undo that. And instead on this dodge burn layer, I want to create a lights luminosity selection to help target the highlights. That's going to give me a better ability to dodge the highlights only and not lighten those shadow areas. To load this as a selection, I just click on the cell button in Lumenzia. And now I come back, and now when I brush, it's lightening up that detail, but it's not lightening up the shadow areas behind it, which gives it just a better, more interesting look. And now you can see before and after how that just nicely draws some attention where it's needed there. I also want to lighten the eye, but it's not a highlight, so I'm going to hit Command or Control D to deselect, and we'll see the cell button's now no longer green, which tells us there's no active selection. I want to target these interior areas of the eye. If I go click on something like maybe zone A for something very dark. That seems like that'll work just fine. You can see the eye is selected there and not so much the brighter elements around it. I could make it even more targeted by bringing this down further and further with the slider until I find just what I want for targeting these dark areas, which is somewhere around here. I just want to make sure I get the back edge of that iris so I'm not missing a little bit of detail there. And maybe it's just not even really in the raw. So we'll go with that, load that as a selection. And again, I'm going to dodge this with white, but this time I've got that dark mid-tone selection, that zone A selection that gave us from before to after to bring out a lot more interesting detail in the bird's eye. Now that we've done that, I want to go and add some of that definition to the feathers, and I wouldn't mind darkening the back edge of this bird. There's a pretty bright halo there. It's not really a halo, but it is the plumage, but I'd like to darken it down because it kind of has the effect of being a halo. So I'm going to hit Command or Control D to deselect. I need another lights selection, and I want to paint black through it to go darken the bright things. So I can go click on L for a light selection. I can bring that down with the slider a bit to further differentiate, maybe down to somewhere around between 2 and 3, I think is going to get the job done. So let's go with lights 2.5, load that as a selection. And now with our black paint, start painting these areas to help darken down the bird. And you notice there's a dark halo starting to form around the bird here because I'm painting on the background as well, or at least the dodging and burning is affecting it. So what I want to do is only affect the bird. And I fortunately have my layer mask here with the targeting still available. So if we clip this, it will only affect the bird. So just hold the Alt or Option key so you get this bent arrow cursor and then click between the layers. Let's undo that. I kind of did that wrong. Click like this and you get that little clipping group. And from before to after, see how the halo is there without the clipping group, and after the halo is gone, but it's still darkening the bird. So it just targeted where I'm adjusting things. And you can see it from before to after. We brought attention away from this back edge and towards the bird's eye where it really belongs. So that's just kind of tightening things up a bit there. And now, as I look at the bird, I feel like the plumage could be a little bit deeper in some of the shadow detail. So I'm going to burn that down with black as well, but I need a dark selection to hit the darker parts of the bird. So I'm going to hit Command or Control D to deselect. Go hit D for a dark selection. Drag down until I'm really targeting the appropriate details in the feathers. Something like this darks 3 1/4 looks pretty good. So hit cell to load that as a selection. B for my black brush, make it a little bit bigger. And now I'm just going to brush across the body of the bird, which creates a little more definition from before to after to make the bird really kind of stand out there. And as I zoom back on it, I feel like that's really doing a pretty good job. I think we've got really good detail across the bird. The last thing I'd like to do is further target attention in the image. Now I've done a lot of work to try and avoid vignetting in this image. In the original edit, I did a negative vignette to get the corners even. In the raw processing, I forgot to mention it, but in the raw processing, I actually had a few gradients to help remove some adjustments of color in the edges. And I've just tried to keep the background as flat as possible. Now I want to add a little bit better definition. So I'm going to hit L for my lasso and create a rough vignette selection that's going to help target the bird here towards the top left. And when I click on vignette, see how it nicely draws the viewer's attention to where it needs to be. So rather than having the arbitrary vignetting in the corners that's a little bit sharp, it's bringing the attention more towards the bird in a soft, even way with this vignette. And I might even soften it up a bit by bringing this up a little bit, maybe around 500 pixels or so, and just compare before and after with that vignette, how nicely that brings the attention into the bird. And if we look at the overall edit, we'll turn our original raw on so we can see it, and now just compare from the original here, where it was very yellow, there was a lack of color definition, the background is as bright as the bird, the detail in the plumage and the eyes and all, it's just not there, to after, where you have a much more crisp and interesting version of this bird. And be sure to click on this next video where you'll learn how to use select and mask to remove halos and clean up the edges of your masks.